Buying
you
followers.
10, 9, 8,
Okay,
7,
so we're gonna call the ad.
Welcome to Gather Geeks, a podcast by BizBash, the place where people passionate about meetings and events come together. This episode is a Gather Geeks special sponsor edition. Here's your host, BizBash chairman and founder, David Adler.
Today on this special sponsored edition of Gather Geeks, we are exploring why it is so hard to emulate high-touch events such as the G8 World Leaders Summit and how other tools of diplomacy can work in the virtual world. We will talk about the importance of making technology almost invisible when it comes to everything from curated group conversations to this unforced one-on-one meetings. We will also get into the future of virtual events, asking questions such as, will hybrid be the pre-event strategy that connects people in advance of your meetings? Will on-demand conversation hubs like Clubhouse have an impact on the traditional events that are happening today? And what will be the state of how we create collaboration artists to make people connect in general ways? But spoiler alert, one thing that is clear is that we just don't know for sure what's going to happen. Our guests today are Steve Gottlieb, the founder and CEO of the virtual platform Shindig, and Natalie Jones, the Senior Vice President of External Affairs and Diplomatic Engagement for the nonpartisan diplomacy center called Meridian House in Washington, D.C. I worked with Natalie at the State Department, and we pioneered such really incredible programs as the Diplomatic Culinary Partnership and the American Chef Corps, where we inducted 100 chefs to be ambassadors. In her regular role at the State Department, she led large teams to plan and execute high-level international summits and diplomatic events, serving as the central interlocutor between foreign governments, the United States Department of State, and the White House through the complex planning process. Steve comes from the music business and was the founder of TVT Records, one of the largest and most successful independent record labels in the history of the United States. He discovered and spearheaded the careers of such artists as Nine Inch Nails, Ja Rule, Lil Jon, Pitbull, Seven Dust, Brian Jonestown Massacre, and KMFDM, among many others. You will hear how this unlikely duo matched up to serve the diplomatic community with a very effective solution that has taken the best of the fandom world and the world of diplomacy to create solutions that work for others.
We're now in a whole different world. And as much as people want to go back to events yesteryear, they now have to deal with the fact that there is a whole world of people who are going to lean into this. The same way they're going to be the Teslas of the event space, who are now going to be making the virtual event not just competitive with the in-person event, but superior, more sustainable, more targeted on the user benefit than the values of the past.
So I believe that the whole thing, and Natalie, I think you probably will agree with this, is that in order to get things done, you have to establish trust and scale intimacy.
Yes.
So that you're no longer a one-way vehicle, or you're just sort of sitting there as a nobody sitting in an audience. Like the way chairs are sitting facing the audience is like we've been doing that for 1,000 years. And so you created the technology to allow these smaller groups to allow more engagement. It seems like, am I correct with that?
I'll speak from my vantage point as using Shindig at Meridian. Shindig took our events from passive events and one-dimensional events to these amazing, active, multidimensional, nuanced events where, really as the participant, you were in the driver's seat of who you wanted to converse with. And that was something that we could never have recreated through our other platforms, whether it was Zoom or Teams. And David, I always think about what you consider a success marker for an event. And that's if you have people come away with saying, let's do this, let's work on this. And there's no way, and that's the marker of our success at Meridian, is when we're able to connect people, different backgrounds, who can work on a global issue together or work on a challenge, and they can come together with, let's follow up on that. And there's no way that could be done on these one-dimensional platforms.
So we all watch the Jetsons, and we all, right? Ultimately, we come down to the Jetsons. And what did you now say, I don't want to be like the Jetsons and I want to do something different? Like, was your thinking? And you as a scientist and a thinker and all of that, how did you see it differently?
I was at a TED conference and I heard an anthropologist talk about workplace rules and why factory workers should have access to their cell phones on the factory floor. And they said autonomy over where you direct your attention is now a fundamental right. And the light bulb went off. That's why everyone hates these webinars and whatnot. They have no autonomy. They're kind of just supposed to sit there and listen and be good attendees. We forget webinars, the whole idea of permission marketing was based on meeting your audience halfway and meeting them where they were. But what had happened was we got them into the webinar and then we just jammed them with message. No real interactivity, no ability to bring them up on stage and take their questions and really hear them out in a meaningful way. They were going to type in their questions and have them read like it was 1964 and Carol Merrill pulled their question out of a barrel and said, oh, here's your question. So that's what inspired the thinking. No one had recognized that now we have a computer in the middle. It's no longer the telephone wires. We can, on the fly, rearrange all these connections. So we can have 1,000 people in an event and they can suddenly be in 500 different conversations and then all listening to the stage again. And they can reform and self-assemble in infinite combinations because it was no longer wires. And no one had really thought of that. And we got 27 patents around that concept. So you can create all the dynamics of an in-person event on Shindig. First, events have a number of modalities. They're not one thing. So, people arrive. People can greet them. They can say hi. They can welcome them. And they all see one another. So you could have hundreds, 1,000 people come to an event and they have an opportunity to mingle and network with one another. We've done parties like reunions and where there's a DJ or a live music on stage and where the whole substance of the event is actually the interaction. There's no presentation. But so you have this concept of people all see one another and in a simple click, they can cluster together in private groups. So it's not breakout rooms where you're isolated from everyone else. It's actually more like a cocktail party where people see one another, they say hi, it's one click.
So how do you deal with the exhibitor sponsorship side? What are the assets that do you deal with that world?
Oh, yeah. We could create a whole event with thousands of sub-events, exhibitor booths, sponsor suites, VIP receptions, and they all have that same structure. So someone could have a booth and either if they have a busy booth, they can take the stage and address 30 people with a demo. If they have a quiet booth, they could have 5 salespeople meeting privately and individually with people. But the big thing is they can say, oh, you should meet my general manager. He'd be really interesting. Or, oh, I'm not the right person to talk to you. Let me give you your rep. And so that ability to move around flexibly is really important to creating productivity.
Can you give us a little bit of the sense of the economics, how it works?
Straightforward and simple. So a lot of the other platforms, every feature is a new add-on. They're all get you in cheap and have all the add-ons. We have a very straightforward model, which is a price per user per hour. For commercial clients, it's $2 per user per hour. For social impact nonprofits and educational institutions, it's $1 per user per hour. So very straightforward. And our philosophy is completely different. Since we're not about unified communications, we're really about events. We think events require complete freedom and imagination to conceive. And so we don't charge for features. We want to give you all the features so you can imagine something great.
So is it full service? Is it self-service? How does a client get onboarded as well?
They're both self-service and we do a lot of training. We have regular client trainings. We offer white glove services where we'll help you produce an event. But because the technology is so resilient, you can have 4 admins. It's built for training. So it's super easy to train people. It's super easy once in an organization for them to share the knowledge. We long ago learned that no one reads instructions. No one wants instructions. And technology, for it to really work.
What are the best use cases of this? Is it you have conferences, you have training, you have just regular meetings, you have galas, you have trade shows. What are anything other than those?
The event space is obviously a big focus in terms of conferences. The technology has very broad application from gaming and social and parties and media. We have a bunch of new media clients that we're very excited about what they're going to be doing with it. Education, this allows a teacher to go from addressing the entire class to giving individualized attention to individual students and then going back to the head of the class. So big applications in education. Our clients really go across the board from government organizations, politics, big nonprofits, to the Amazons, Accentures, Gartners, all kinds of big corporate, clients.
Could you do paid events as well?
Built-in ticketing, everything from super restricted private events to lead gen events for marketing companies.
I've noticed in some of the other platforms that they've gotten hit with hacking and things like that. How sophisticated is it so you are able to carefully deal with that?
So our architecture, because it's a lot of these other platforms don't even do their own video. They're built on, there are a couple on Agora, which is a Chinese company, and some of these other video platforms. But they're pretty buttoned up and tight, and I think our security is far better than the others out there. We have a much more sophisticated ability to control who gets into an event because we don't have this notion of perpetual rooms that the other platforms have, because they were built for unified communications, 10-person conversations of everyone within a Fortune 100 company. Events, every one of our URLs is different, and the security is based per event, so much tighter and more restricted.
How about marquee events? What are the things that made you smile?
We did John Legend, the Global Citizen, backstage for the Global Citizen Awards he did on NBC. That was super great. We had Mary J. Blige to introduce her new wine on Shindig. We did a great VIP inauguration reception for the Human Rights Campaign to celebrate all their hard work in the campaign. I'm really proud of what we've done for reunions at colleges, because watching reunion classes get together is pretty gratifying. But we've done everything from reunion classes where everyone was in their 90s and author events where everyone was under 10. We did Origami Yoda author, and we did Swathmore class of 1947. So we've done a pretty wide gamut of types of audiences. I think what put us in a great position, David, is that this wasn't built as a response to COVID. There were a lot of people who came and just glued together, let's add speed dating to Zoom, or let's add this thing or that thing. Or we were conceived a decade before COVID with the thought process of what if it were possible to convene people online and give all the interactivity, the rich, nuanced experience of an in-person event virtually. So it wasn't something that could have happened in a month, because people are complicated. And human experience is complicated. And a lot of the other technologies were very reductionist, very simplified. So we entered this space a decade ago, really looking at the same time Zoom was imagined. There's a reason why Zoom and Teams and GoToMeeting and WebEx all look alike. They're all, whatever they may call themselves, video conferencing, they're all really picture phones. They're all based on the technology introduced in 1964 of a telephone call with picture. And the only thing they've added is a text waterfall chat. But they're really that same 1964 architecture. The webinar, which is most of them at scale, turned into a webinar. Monica Lewinsky was an intern when the webinar was first introduced. The technology hasn't advanced since then. So we entered a space where, despite all the talk about innovations, it was really frozen in time.
So we all watched the Jetsons, and we all, right? Ultimately, we come down to the Jetsons. And what did you now say, I don't want to be like the Jetsons and I want to do something different? Like, was your thinking? And you as a scientist and a thinker and all of that, how did you see it differently?
I was at a TED conference and I heard an anthropologist talk about workplace rules and why factory workers should have access to their cell phones on the factory floor. And they said autonomy over where you direct your attention is now a fundamental right. And the light bulb went off. That's why everyone hates these webinars and whatnot. They have no autonomy. They're kind of just supposed to sit there and listen and be good attendees. We forget webinars, the whole idea of permission marketing was based on meeting your audience halfway and meeting them where they were. But what had happened was we got them into the webinar and then we just jammed them with message. No real interactivity, no ability to bring them up on stage and take their questions and really hear them out in a meaningful way. They were going to type in their questions and have them read like it was 1964 and Carol Merrill pulled their question out of a barrel and said, oh, here's your question. So that's what inspired the thinking. No one had recognized that now we have a computer in the middle. It's no longer the telephone wires. We can, on the fly, rearrange all these connections. So we can have 1,000 people in an event and they can suddenly be in 500 different conversations and then all listening to the stage again. And they can reform and self-assemble in infinite combinations because it was no longer wires. And no one had really thought of that. And we got 27 patents around that concept.
I want to divert a little bit to Natalie's world in terms of the way when we work together at the State Department. But I want to find out if it's the same when you worked on G8s and whoever is in at the time. Is the fundamental aspect of getting to the LETs the same when you're dealing with these world leaders at Camp David as you're dealing with diplomats and you're dealing with or engineers at a conference that are planning a product? Are you seeing a lot of similarities that are people, and how do you become that collaboration artist even with the highest level of people in the world?
Look, I think a lot of the same elements are still there. There is in a way an engineered group conversation. But to get to that engineered group conversation, you need a lot of those side conversations to happen. You need a lot of that relationship building and trust building on the side to be able to get to a place where you can have open, constructive back and forth. So those elements are the same, whether it's a G8, whether it's a staff meeting. This
is actually part of what Steve's built, in a sense, how the bilats work. Like all of a sudden, you don't see Barack Obama and the president of another country. All of a sudden, this is a good idea. Let's discuss it. Let's spitball some ideas.
Right. I loved during any of those world summits, we engineered those interactions to take place. So for each summit we did, we had the main plenary room, and then we had a series of bilat rooms where leader to leader could meet. And you would reserve those. But then we had this lounge space that allowed those very impromptu kind of candid interactions to take place. You can have that kind of one conversation, but then you can have those breakoffs. And I think that helps to recreate.
So did the products that Steve built with Shindig, did it remind you of that? And that's one of the reasons that it made sense for Meridian House, that deals with diplomats around the world and it's a miniature version of the United Nations?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of just I think how the world works and how Washington works. The business gets done before the meeting or during the break, or that pull aside moment is so much more powerful sometimes than that facilitated, engineered conversation. Because that's when you can just say, take the step aside, Senator, can I talk to you about this? Or Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to talk to you about this. And sometimes it's not, can't have it for the world to see. And Shindig allows those kind of private moments to take place.
So how did you engineer using Shindig? Because Shindig is a technology. And still, the collaboration artist still has to go in and make sure that it's being programmed properly. What about how you did it made it work? Because a lot of people turn on technology and they think, oh my God, everybody's going to talk to everybody. What did you do to make it work?
We thought a lot about it. And the first time we used it was for our Meridian Ball and Global Leadership Summit, which was completely virtual. But the magic of that event are the connections that are formed. So we used Shindig for an evening kind of networking reception. And we looked at our guest list, and on our staff, we assigned host, because we thought, okay, people walking into this or logging into this for their first time don't know what to do. So one, we made sure that when folks joined, they were personally welcomed by a staff member, asked if all their tech was working. Then two, we would look at our guest list and say, okay, we would assign our staff hosts and say, we want everyone to make sure an ambassador is not alone. So make sure to bring an ambassador into your group. And then we also looked that there were some strategic connections that people wanted to make. We had a number of our corporate partners who wanted to meet certain ambassadors or certain government officials. And we made sure as hosts that we brought those initial connections together, and then we stepped back.
But it's not unlike the actual event.
It's not unlike the actual event. It's like seating. It's almost thinking about it like seating in a way at first, but it's much more dynamic than that.
But you have, just to give people background, the Meridian House Ball is not a traditional ball. Traditionally, you go and you spend dinner at an ambassador's residence at a really cool dinner party, which creates the intimacy. And then they get together for the dessert, and everybody. So these small groups are now becoming part of the bigger group, which emulates a little bit about what Shindig does. And it's one of the few technologies that I've seen actually live up to the promise of doing that.
Completely. And you know what I loved about it? It's very efficient. You can get from a business, you can approach it from the business side or the social side. From a business side, if you're looking to specifically connect with a few people, instead of looking at a crowded room, you can just type in their name and click on them and join that conversation. And the other thing too, and as host, we told our guests, you have to put social norms aside. In a reception, you're able to delicately enter a conversation or delicately remove yourself from a conversation. Say, oh, I have to get a drink at the bar. In Shindig, you drop in and you drop out. And that's okay. Just people can party hop. People can go from one group to another and don't feel like you have to be locked into this group. And we gave permission for people to do that.
I love that. One of the things, the big thing in Washington is the idea of how do you get out of that conversation that you're into, and that you use the old trick is, oh, my glass is half filled. You always have a half filled glass, so you have to go to the bar. But all these little signals are not as trivial as people think. And I think what you've done in the technology, I don't know if you've thought this way out, but that's why I originally loved this concept, and why when you think about it from a real practical point of view, it works. Steve, how did you actually? Did you think that this use case was what you were planning for, or did this just happen to be a great serendipity experiment that worked?
No, so you remember my background, I had a 25-year career in the music business. And that was really in building fan bases like Nine Inch Nails and Pitbull and Ja Rule. And it was all about things that didn't depend on top 40, but rather depended on super serving super fans and creating evangelicals and tremendous word of mouth. And so that came really from nurturing deep sense of community. And so that was really what Shindig was intended when I first thought about it for artist fan engagement, that it was both a platform for artists to do Q&As with fans, but also allow the fans to share their passions with one another. The challenge, you talk about it, the challenge was to make the technology disappear. So that it was a lot of the reason why Natalie and Meridian were power users and superstar clients, and their events were so amazing that we got a dozen embassies sign on as clients after her event. The French and Mexican embassies just did a big International Women's Day event this past week. But the reason why is because she appreciated just that way, that it wasn't about the conversations she talks about wouldn't happen if they were scheduled. They wouldn't happen if they had to be dealt with very head-on, frontal. I need to book a half hour with you to talk about my agenda. They happen maybe because the host says, I want you to say hello to congressmen or ambassadors, meet ambassadors, or big heavy donor, meet this country representative. You guys should really talk about, you have this issue in common. And it's that kind of nuanced engagement that technology can't reproduce.
Well, you're talking my language. I believe I said earlier that I believe event organizers have to be collaboration artists first. And that one of the things that we at the State Department, the concept of smart power or that was the holy grail. It was the white space. It was moving the antiques around in the ballroom so that the people that are being invited will relate to what's in the room, or having the right chef with the right food to connect people. And so all this technology, without the collaboration artist using it, will be effective or not effective based on what they do. And I believe that the training and the understanding that Natalie has of being the deputy chief of protocol and also being the person on the ground, understanding how ideas flow. There's a book called Social Physics, How Ideas Flow by Alex Pentland. And he studies the idea of where you put the bar, for example. He doesn't really get into that, but I'm interpolating that you put the bar in the right spot and you're conditioning conversations that'll happen, the white space conversations, the smart power conversations, and the decor and all of that are a way to democratize a room so people are feeling comfortable to have conversations. And you judge an event not by how many people attend, but how many conversations you're curating.
That is where the name, why we chose the name Shindig, to suggest that unlike the top-down hierarchy, WebEx and Webinar and Zoom and Teams, this now enabled those spontaneous engagements, that serendipity to also occur. And that's why a lighthearted name Shindig.
Yeah, but I do agree, David, it almost, I think, and Steve, it needs like a driver's manual for your event planners on how to most successfully use it, because you do have this amazing technology and it steps away, but there is this level of thought to curate those conversations and groups of and people that maybe event planners might not think they need in this virtual time. You think about it when you're seating a dinner, you're planning a reception, but the two need to go hand in hand. You need to make that extra effort virtually.
My personal feeling is that the future superstars of the world are going to be taking the same path that the famous chefs took, where all of a sudden they were in the back room cooking and now they're superstars. The collaboration artists, if you can put together a climate conference to impact thousands of people, that's a skill. If you can do things that we thought were trivial, being a party planner was trivial for many years, and we always get painted as that. When the real thing is, this is where ideas flow, and you never know what's going to happen.
David, I think in devising the tech, it was exactly with the understanding that tech could not recreate events, that you couldn't use AI to pair people, you couldn't force people into conversations, you couldn't ignore the social hierarchy and just assume, oh, the CEOs are going to sign up to meet with the non-CEOs 5 minutes at a time because there's no hierarchy. You can't ignore that. This technology was built precisely with this need for the event planner. Some of these companies think they can go direct to the organizations, and now they'll just go to corporation XYZ and you can throw an event yourself. Just buy this service. It's all done for you. Whether it's virtual or in person, virtual events require more of a planning genius, more of someone creative to really make the experience unique and inventive and dynamic and something that is worthy of people's time than just another YouTube video or pre-record or whatever.
Let me go into what's next, because one of the things that I have found that constraints are the greatest thing for progress, because we could not leave our homes. So we had no choice but to do this. What is going to happen when the world opens up again? And how does this integrate into the new world? I know we said that it won't be the same, but how will it be different than what was? Natalie, as a user, are you going to go right back and say, okay, we don't need as much of this virtual? Or are you going to figure out a way to either combine it, use it separately, or use it together?
I think event planners are going to have kind of harder decisions to make because you can't just necessarily have every event be hybrid. People are going to have, I think, greater choice now. And I think they're going to feel greater permission to say no to in-person events. So one, you have to make sure if you're having an in-person event that there's a reason that's an in-person event, that it's not just the content that you're getting, it's the connections, and you really got to wow people, I think, to bring them out. If it's hybrid, you really have to think through, is this going to augment my event? Is this going to help make it better? Or is it going to dilute it? Because I could see potentially if you have a hybrid event, maybe people feel like they can stay home and you don't have splitting the baby doesn't necessarily work. But it could work if you're intentional about it and you say, we want to have a broader reach. We want to get a global audience, people who would never have been able to make it here in person, or look at it from an equity perspective. I think there's going to be just a lot of, it's not going to be black and white of whether you have something in person, hybrid, or virtual. But I love that it gives more options because, to be honest, we never had a virtual event prior to the pandemic. And I know we will post-pandemic. It's just, how do you integrate that in a smart way?
I totally agree with you. I do believe that when people start going to full live, an event starts the minute the invitation goes out to the event. So I believe that there's going to be a pre-event to get to meet people and then have the real live event. And so that's another way of building that FOMO and anticipation, because what happens is when people do meet online, everything that happens, I don't know if you've been on Clubhouse yet.
Not yet. I've heard about it.
Clubhouse is an amazing technology, but every one of those technologies is going to drive people to say, oh my God, I have to get together with you. And so all of these technologies are going to drive face-to-face. So I think virtual is going to be a teaser for many face-to-faces too.
Right. That's a good way to think about that. I haven't thought about it that way.
And it gives you the preview of what you're going to see, especially among the people that really want to. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be turn on the camera at the event, but it's going to be in the strategy is going to be really interesting to use it. And some of them will be a global audience. Is going to be better to do a virtual event or a hybrid event. Steve, what are your thoughts on this? We're making it up as we go too.
It is usually complicated. And the most obvious thought, I think you're echoing this, is it's not going to be turning on the camera and offering a live stream, that this is going to have profound implications. The first people who are going to want to take advantage of being remote are going to be the high value speakers who are not going to want to deal with the travel to make an appearance. And once you lose some of those high value speakers, you diminish a lot of the economics of the sponsor and the other audience to come if they no longer have a chance to rub elbows with the high value player. But the big picture view that I see is when we knock text off, books off, as the apotheosis of text, we had everything from Twitter to Wikipedia. You're going to see that same evolution with events. That it is no longer going to be about creating this pent-up demand so you have everyone who is anyone appearing in July at this event, because they're going to be competing with that pent-up demand isn't going to exist, because people on Clubhouse are going to be delivering events at the moment when people are talking about it, when there's the urgency. That urgency is going to be that drives events. It's going to be captured by event producers who convene the right audience at the right time to share their thoughts about the topic of the moment. And so in that world of a plethora of events, 365 days a year, it's going to up the ante, but it's going to take to get everyone together for the in-person event. We're going to love those events. They're going to be great, deep rock, but it's going to be it's going to exist in a whole different world.
Yeah, the content of events. I always think about events, you have like your content and your connections. And I totally agree, Steve. Like when you can consume the content in another way and in a more timely and convenient way, then virtual it completely makes sense. It's the human. So then you really have to rethink your event, right? You're not holding out for this speaker to give insight because that speaker probably was already part of a virtual event.
Hear everything he has to say. I believe that content is no longer king, but contact is king.
Contact. Yeah, I like that.
Even at events, but it's even at the virtual event, pre-virtual event, that lets you know who the players are, so that when you go into the real event, you got the playbook. Because what happens is you don't, except in Washington where everyone's in the paper. I remember when I went to New York and all these famous people were there, but I didn't know what they looked like because they weren't covered all the time. In Washington, I go to lunch and I see them having lunch and they're household names, but you need a little bit of a playbook in advance to get warmed up. So I think the warm-up phase is going to be this virtual stuff and the pre-conversations, which could end up being even more, but then you have the FOMO of wanting to meet them in person and touch the flesh. And the oxytocin exchange, the chemical exchange between people, is real. And people say that there's this big thing in the exhibition world that we want to serve everyone 365 days a year. And that seems to be the new common thing. And I was in the magazine business for many years, and that's expensive to do that because you have to have editors and you have to have content on an ongoing basis, where the purpose of an event is a trust accelerator. So the minute you meet somebody at an event, the trust happens. So then you can communicate in all different ways. And it doesn't have to be through just content. Because if contact is king, then content is universal. And it's not as important to serve people in that way. That makes sense?
Totally, 100%.
So if I can add a model, we're talking with one of the very big prestigious event institutions right now about their upcoming event. And I don't want to, one of the things they're thinking of that I think is brilliant and exactly how people are going to think about threading the needle is they're thinking about a super exclusive event, effectively just for all the speakers, where all the speakers will assemble in one place and get to rub elbows. And then the audience will all be virtual and online. But so they'll have this combination of this very high level exclusive event and this huge global virtual event. So,
do you know what I do at all of my conferences the day before? I host, and I totally believe in this, and I want to do this when COVID is over and have everybody over to do these Jeffersonian style dinner parties. Because what they do, I bring all the speakers in the night before to do a Jeffersonian style dinner party. So the next day when they speak on stage, they are so pumped. And so you can feel the excitement, which I think is, we all go back to Maya Angelou's statement. People do not remember what you said, but they remember how you made them feel. Anything that you can do to stimulate that. You even know when in State Department, when you give a gift beforehand, there is the feelings that happen that you cannot bottle up. You just don't know what. That's why the gift giving is so much part of protocol. Even if it's the puppy from, like the stuffed puppy from Barack Obama's collection that he had at the State Department. But all these things, that I think that's a brilliant move. And I think that you're going to see these new strategies that are happening that are going to be enabled by virtual, but it's just one tool in the tool. How has your experience with Shindig at House changed the culture?
I think it's made us think about events that we would not normally do. For instance, we usually have a new ambassadors reception. We host twice a year. We welcome all the new ambassadors. We introduce them to the Washington, D.C. community. Before Shindig, that wasn't even just a possibility for us. There's no way we could do that over Zoom, but with Shindig, we can. So I think the culture has shifted in expanding our ideas and creativity about what we can translate online.
So how does it feel? When did you start this?
The ideation really started a decade ago.
And how does it feel to have, we went through, a virtual had sort of a lack of respect for many years, and now that's a prime seat at the table. How do you feel about that?
I feel pretty great about it, and as inspired and excited, because it's really just the beginning. It is just the beginning. And so to watch the transformation and to see, when you think about it, the amount of creativity and efficiency that's going to be unleashed by virtual events in terms of the savings of time and money and connecting people. You're the dean of connecting. Contact is king. The liberation and the amount of fostering sharing of ideas and is just going to be accelerated. So in a way, this is part of the big internet technological revolution of just accelerating sharing, accelerating innovation, accelerating personal fulfillment. I just couldn't be more excited to be a part of that.
Last question. 5 years down the road, what is this going to look like?
Look, tech changes slowly. While we may see adoption is very slow. And in fact, to be honest, we're going to see some retrenchment now as everyone begins to focus, we got to get back to normal. People are going to have to learn again. They're going to try to get back to normal. They're going to have to go through a whole new learning cycle. Is normal working the way we had hoped it would? And do we have to pivot back? So I have no illusions. Tech begins and goes through bumps, and everyone has to get comfortable and learn and has their own timetable. So 5 years, we're going to see the innovators like Natalie and her vision shared more widely, because ultimately it's not technology that counts. It is the creative uses of technology. It is serving the needs that counts. And that's only going to happen when our event providers and event organizers and event hosts and sponsors all kind of digest it and understand it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. We can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Player FM, Google Play, and Pocket Cast. Be sure to leave us a rating and review. It helps others discover the Gather Geeks podcast. We'd also love to hear from you. You can leave feedback on Twitter @GatherGeeks or leave us an email, gathergeeks@bizbash.com. We hope you'll join us again for the next episode of Gather Geeks. Until then, gather on.